And, this has lessons plans provided for it by the teacher's manual called Take 10 for Jazz. While you're getting this packet out, I'd like to make the distinction between what a composer does and what an improviser does. They both create music, but the composer has a luxury that the improviser does not. And that luxury is this. The composer, prior to publication, can change the music that he or she created, alter it, correct it, improve it. The improvisers, every improvisation is definitive, by contrast. And every improvisation is supposed to be unique, distinctive. Never played that way before, never played that way again. The same way. Any improviser caught duplicating a previous improvisation will wind up in musical purgatory, which consists of not being able to get work, because the excitement for you, the listener, when hearing an improviser is the knowledge that that improvisation was not done that way before, will never be done that way again. So for better or worse, that improvisation is definitive. From a pedagogical perspective, however, when you ask your students to improvise, and they improvise, that music is very ephemeral. It's gone, and it's not there to be analyzed to see if the student did what you asked the student to do. So I recommend that your students write down some of their improvisations so that you can analyze what they're doing. And in my books, where after my illustration of a particular point, I say, now improvise your own, I cross out the word improvise. And over it, I write the word compose, so the sentence reads, now compose your own, because I want to see the written representation on music manuscript paper, and then we can analyze to see if the student put into the music what I asked for, the blue note, the flatted third, whatever. Well, let's look at this book. On page 3, beginning jazz improvisation, as you can see at the top of page 3, I work with blues structure, the 12 bars that use the tonic, subdominant, and dominant subchord. If you look at the bottom of page 3 and the top of page 4, you'll see what those notes look like when I combine blue notes with chord tones. At the bottom of page 4, I labeled rhythm has to be inherently jazzy, and the student can either work with my rhythms or at the middle of page 5, create the student's own rhythms. In the middle of page 5, I ask the student to improvise, combining one blue note, the flatted third, with chord tones. So when playing blues structure chords in the left hand, or one chord in the key of C major chord, the right hand for melody notes would use those same pitches, C, E, and G, plus E flat, the flatted third of C. When playing the 4 chord, the subdominant chord, the left hand will play those same pitches, F, A, C, plus A flat, the flatted third of F, the blue note. And the same for the 5 chord. Combining one blue note with chord tones and blues structure and using 1 or 2 different rhythms. Here on top of page 6 is my example of combining one blue note with flatted third with chord tones in blues structure. It says, now improvise your own right hand. I cross out the word improvise, and over it I write the word compose. So the sentence reads, now compose your right hand. Of course, I want to see the written representation of what the student's doing. The student comes back to me, and I check for notation first. All those things that I talked about a few minutes ago. Then I check to see that that blue note was employed in combination with chord tones. And then after the student has done that satisfactorily, I give the student blank music manuscript paper. I say, go home and compose another piece for me next week. Again, combining one blue note with chord tones, but this time in another key. So if you're working in another key, you have to be able to tell me what are the 1, 4, and 5 chords in that other key, and what is the flatted third for each of those chords. So right away, the student is learning transposition without even realizing it. Folks, there are 12 keys. Means you can have 12 weeks of work out of this one assignment. On page 8, the student is asked to combine 2 blue notes with chord tones, and again you can work in 12 keys. On page 9, the student is asked to combine 3 blue notes with chord tones. Again, you can get 36 weeks out of these 3 pages. Now look, pages 11 through 13 contain boogie-woogie bass ostinato patterns. Boogie-woogie was a very popular way of playing jazz in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And blues structure was the format of all boogie-woogie playing in those years. So again, you can ask the student to use these boogie-woogie bass ostinatos and to combine 1 blue note in the right hand with the chord tones as the left hand is playing these ostinatos. But that's not the only material in this book. On page 14, I showed that one could improvise from a lead sheet, one of those pages you find in the fake book. Here is Happy Birthday as a lead sheet, melody, chords, alphabetical chord symbols, but I don't actually, if I had used the lyrics, I'd have had to pay for it because the lyrics are copyrighted. The melody is not, isn't that odd? But the lyrics are copyrighted. So if I can call this, let's say, Party Song, and I won't get sued. If I call it Happy Birthday, they'll say, where's my money? So now, if I want to provide a realization of this, I could play it in a rock style, I can play it in classical style, jazz style. When I taped my improvisation of Happy Birthday, I noticed, when I wrote it down, that I had put a lot of jazz elements in there, and I listed them all on the top of page 15. Here's my improvisation. On page 15, I provided a lead sheet of Auld Lang Syne, and I asked the student to go home and create a written arrangement, to improvise, but then to write it down on page 16 to show me what the student did. Page 16 was the easiest page of this book for me to write. The reason why this book is considered intermediate level is because the student is not asked to provide too many different rhythms. The follow-up book to this book, called the Jazz Tetrachord Approach to Keyboard Jazz Improvisation, requires that the student use a minimum of 3 rhythms when working with this book. So the book becomes upper intermediate level. There are lesson plans provided for this book by the follow-up teacher's manual, Take 10 More for Jazz. This is one of the 3 books that I told you early on were inspired by the book called Jazz Hot and Hybrid by Richard Sargent. On the top of page 3, I give him credit for having inspired me to write this book. In order to work with the material of this book, you have to know the theory on page 2, which is specifically what is a tetrachord and what is the blues scale with its blue notes. If you go to page 4, you'll see 2 groups of tones. When the earliest jazz musicians improvised, if they heard a C chord, by the way, I changed all my chords to dominant 7th here in this book. Instead of C major, I play C7. Instead of F major, I play F7. The G7 is already G7. And I do that to give my music a greater sense of motion. But when Louis Armstrong heard a C chord or a C7 chord, he would think C major scale. Of course, he didn't think anything. It was all instinctive. But he'd think C major scale, and he would extract from it the 6th, the tonic, the 2nd, and the flatted 3rd, that group of tones on page 4. Or the 3rd, the 5th, the 6th, and the flatted 7th. And he would improvise with that combination of tones against that chord. And if you look at page 5 and compare figure 1 with figure 1A below, figure 2 with figure 2A below, you'll see that the melodic tendencies within each of these 2 so-called jazz tetrachords, that's what I call them, were identical. By the way, a point of historical interest. In the lower jazz tetrachord, you have the flatted 3rd. In the upper jazz tetrachord, you have the flatted 7th, but there's no flatted 5th anywhere. Where is that blue note, the flatted 5th? It's not there. Winthrop Sargent did his research based upon music of the 1920s, and he wrote his book in the 1930s. The blue note, the flatted 5th, did not come into usage in jazz until the 1940s, with the advent of the bebop era. Charlie Parker, the alto saxophonist, Dizzy Gillespie, Max Roach, the drummer, Thelonious Monk, and Bud Powell, the pianist. Those were the most important figures in the bebop era, and that's when the new blue note entered the jazz language. In fact, if you examine the music of George Gershwin, you'll find that there are lots of flatted thirds, a lot of flatted sevenths, but not even one flatted fifth. Why? He died before 1940. If he had lived into the 40s, you can be sure he would have included this latest piece of data from the jazz language. On page 6, I present the blues format, the blues chord format. On page 7, I have rhythm patterns that I've labeled A, B, C, D, and so on. I know them to be inherently jazzy, or the students can create their own. At the bottom of page 7, I say that the beginning jazz improviser's first efforts often lack rhythmic interest. I used to conduct jazz master classes, and I noticed that the weakest pianists were the ones who used the narrowest scope of rhythms. So I would try to make them aware of this and try to improve their playing by getting them to use a wider variety of rhythms. I noticed other things also. For example, I noticed that most improvisers stick around here, but there are a lot of notes up here and a lot of notes down here. Also, I noticed that the improvisers always improvise with the right hand and the left hand plays the chords. But you can do it the other way too. The right hand can play the chords and the left hand. I often have students play from a fake book in which they do it two ways. They'll play melody in the right hand, chords in the left, like this. And then I'll ask them to play the melody and the chord in the right hand and only a bass note in the left. Students find it harder to think chords with the right hand. But that's the way a lot of good players play, see, and I like to have them interpret my fake books both ways. And then as a third challenge, I ask them to play both hands roughly an equal number of notes. And then I get them into different styles. Gradually expand their horizons that way. Well, I wrote an article after I had conducted a few master classes in which I described what it is that I listen for in a jazz master class. And Clavier published that article, and that article appears in one of the books you're taking home free called Topics in Jazz and Musical Creativity. It appears on page 18. The article is called Jazzing It Up in Style. The real title of the article is the subtitle, Guidelines for Keyboard Jazz Performance. If you read this article, it will give you a real good idea of what you might be able to put, what you should listen for in your students' performances and what you might be able to put into your own performances in jazz. Let's please look at the Jazz Tetrachords book again, page 8. The student is asked to combine the tones of only the lower jazz tetrachords with the respective chords of blues structure. So when playing the one chord in C major, the C major chord, or C7, you think C major scale, you extract from it the sixth note of that scale, the tonic, the second, and the flatted third. When playing the subdominant chord, the F chord, you think F major scale, take out of it 6, 1, 2, flat 3. When playing the dominant chord, the G chord, you take out of it the sixth, the tonic, the second, and the flatted third. You're taking out of the G major scale. So you're thinking three different scales here. Here's my improvisation in which I'm using three different rhythms. Improvise your own. And I cross out the word improvise and over and I write the word compose, and the sentence reads now compose your own, because I want the student to know that he or she has to come back to me with something. Correct grammar and correct syntax. We could not speak incorrectly or slang or anything like that. And I'd say to him, Dad, I need to write a composition on a certain topic. Can you suggest an opening sentence to help me get me started? And he'd suggest an opening sentence, and it often would help get me going. Although there were times that I must admit, I used to say to him, what comes next? The student comes back to me, I check for notation first, then I check for content. Now on page 10, we work with the tones of the upper jazz tetrachord, and since this is tertian or triadic music, you want to hear a tone once in a while. So, and this upper tetrachord doesn't have it. So I say combine the tones of the upper jazz tetrachord, 3, 5, 6, flat 7 of the scale of C major, and plus C the tonic. The 4 chord, take an F major scale, 3, 5, 6, flat 7, you have the F major scale, plus the tonic, and the same thing here. And then I have a piece, and I ask the student to create a piece as well. But then on page 16, for the first time, the student, they work with the tones of both the lower and upper jazz tetrachords. So when playing that one chord, you can work with 6, 1, 2, flat 3, 3, 5, 6, flat 7. And this is my piece. C major on page 18, or rather page 20. So the student has to tell me what are the 1, 4, and 5 chords of blues structure, what are the tones of the lower and upper jazz tetrachords, and then the student creates a composition in F major. On the next page, the student works in G major, again creating a new composition using the tones of the lower and upper jazz tetrachord. And when you close the book, lo and behold, there are 9 more keys that you can still continue to work on. Those books that I have just shown you, those 2 improvisation books, have been on the market for a long time. But my most recent books that I suspect may become my most important improvisation books are Discovering Blues Improvisation books 1 and 2. Each one of these books has a CD of me playing the contents of the book. If you look, for example, at that's in the same package, package 2. If you look at the table of contents of both books, you'll see that each piece that I've composed, each blues composition that I've composed, is named after, you all have this? Here you go. And each piece that I've composed is named after a famous jazz musician. So for example, in book 1, I have blues for Jelly Roll Morton, blues for Bessie Smith, blues for Bix Beiderbecke, Satchmo is of course Louis Armstrong, Father is Earl Father Hines, the great pianist, Count Basie, and Duke Ellington. And in the back of the book, if you look at book 1, pages 31 and 32, you'll see that I have a brief paragraph listing the very important contributions made by each of these people to the jazz idiom. And while you're on page 31 and 32, you'll notice on pages 29 and page 30, I have bass patterns that your students can employ while creating their improvisations. In book 1, I have a foreword, an introduction on pages 2 and 3, and the introduction continues with an explanation of what vocal blues is all about, what instrumental blues is, what blue notes are, what the blues scale is all about, and other resources for blues improvisation on page 6. And then on page 7, I talk about the jazz rhythmic interpretation of 8th notes called swing eighths. Then the format, if you look at page 8, you'll see that the format is I created 2 choruses of the blues. That is to say, 2 12-bar choruses. And at the end of my 2 12-bar choruses, the student is asked to improvise, here on page 9. And the student is asked to improvise using only the notes of the blues scale. So when playing the C chord or the C7 chord, the student plays the notes of the C blues scale. There's no such thing as a wrong note, see, when you use that scale. When you play the 4 chord, the F chord, you play the F blues scale. And the same thing for the 5 chord. You can't hit a wrong note. That's the advantage of this system. So the format, which is always the format in jazz, is chorus, improvisation, or variations, and then back to the chorus. And I'd like the student to write at least one 12-bar chorus of that improvisation, and then come back and play the original composition. Now, there are also 3 opportunities in this book, in each of the 2 books, for the student to compose their own piece. Look at page 14. Here I provide the instructions for the students to compose their own blues composition, to be followed by an improvisation based upon that composition, and then come back and play the original. So I suspect that these books may turn out to be my greatest contribution to the world of improvisation. But I told you earlier that my most important book in this room for the development of musicianship skills is this one called Learn to Compose and Notate Music. I'd like you to just turn this book around to see the back cover for a moment. On the left column, there are 3 books listed from top to bottom. This book is only the first book in a 3-book series. The other 2 books you don't have there, but they're on that rack on the side of the room, and they look like this. This is Learn to Compose and Notate beginning level. This is Composing at the Piano early intermediate level. At the end of this one, it tells you to go to this one. At the end of this one, it tells you to go to this one. Improvise by learning how to compose intermediate level. If you look at the introduction, opposite page 3 of this book, Learn to Compose, you'll see that there are 4 words underlined: repetition, sequence, retrograde, and inversion. These are the 4 most commonly used techniques by composers of every stripe to unify their composition, make it sound as though all the parts of the composition fit together. Students not only have to know how to compose sounds, but they have to know how to write silences. And therefore we have rests at the bottom of the introduction, because in writing music, you have to account for sounds and silences. The first 3 writing experiences are indeed that. They're writing experiences more than they are composing experiences. We provide a motive. I ask the student at first to put rests in measures 1 through 4, where they belong, whole rests and half rests. And then in the middle of page 3, the instructions say, now with the same notes, G and C, in every octave, compose your own ending to this piece, but using only quarter notes, half notes, and whole notes. Folks, there's a lot of learning that goes into filling a bar of music with the appropriate time signature and using particular note values. I sit there with a pencil, with an eraser, and I say, Jeff, I'm going to erase that note you just put in. I can't tell if it's on the line or the space. Or, did you want that note to be on beat 1? Well, why did you put it in the middle of the bar? It should be at the beginning. You'll find a million reasons to use that eraser. So I do that. The student composes the piece at the lesson while I supervise. Then I send the student home with pages 4 and 5 in the next 2 weeks. And the student, again, puts rests in. And by the way, if you go back to page 3, you'll notice that there's no tempo mark. That's something that students must learn, to put a tempo mark on the dynamic level in every piece that they work with. So that's another thing I ask them to do. Now go to page 6, please, and you'll see we teach repetition and sequence at the same time. Repetition means that you're not only duplicating the pitches, but you're duplicating the rhythms of those pitches. That's repetition. Sequence may be done in 2 ways, as it says in the note to the teacher in the middle of the page. It may be done as an exclusively white key experience, without regard to the exact intervals. Or it may be done as an exact interval experience. Composers do it both ways, and students should know how to do it both ways. And there are different harmonic implications that ensue when you do it one way or the other. And by the way, the whole book may be done as either white key experience or exact interval experience. On page 7, I have a typical piece. We provide a motive. The student at first should put in rests in measures 1 and 2, half rest in measure 1, a whole rest in measure 2, and then to complete that piece, using repetition, sequence, and the original motive in the last 2 bars as instructed, go back and put in the tempo mark and the dynamic level. Now, for the first time, on page 9, the student has to create his or her own motive. And I always tell the student, make it simple, because if you make it complicated, the development is going to be complicated. Then on page 9, we talk about retrograde. Retrograde means the notes of a motive are being presented in backwards order. Ordinarily, one need not present those notes in the same rhythm in backwards order, but in this book we want to have two reasons why the music sounds unified. For example, if this is the motive, this should be the retrograde. The rhythm is the same and the notes are the same, albeit in reverse order. At the top of the page 10 it says retrograde means to play the notes of a motive backwards. While retrogrades may occur in any rhythm, in this book, make all retrogrades appear in the same rhythm as the original motive appeared forward. This will make the retrograde and the motive sound unified. About 15 years ago, America sent a spacecraft to the planet Neptune. Discovered that Neptune spins this way, but there's a moon that goes around Neptune that spins in retrograde to it. I'm so happy to hear the announcer say the retrograde. Sounds like such a tough word. Well, if you look at the first exercise in the middle of page 10, you'll see that the retrograde, in this case, is the notes in backwards order, but in the same rhythm in which it went in forwards order. Students do not have a hard time writing notes in backwards order, but they often have a hard time writing it in the same rhythm. I'll show you mistakes that my students always make. On page 11, second system, first bar, the rhythm is. Now they always want to start the retrograde with a rest because the last bar ended with a rest. But if you're doing the same rhythm, it should be note, rest, note, rest, note, rest, note, rest. On page 12, the first bar, same challenge. 1 and 2 and 3, rest. My students always want to start the retrograde with a rest, but it doesn't go ways because 1 and 2 and 3, rest, 1 and 2 and 3, rest. That's the way the retrograde should be done in this book. On page 15, it says compose your own original composition using repetition, sequence, and retrograde. I want at least one example of each, and I want the student to mark them in the book. If this is the retrograde, and this is it, and so on. It says make the piece 12 bars long, 4 bars on a line. For your composition to be complete, you'll have to add clefs, a time signature, draw bar lines, and add a tempo mark and dynamics. And it refers you to page 24, where there's a glossary of tempo marks and dynamics, all in Italian. Why in Italian? Because of two guys mostly. Guido de Arezzo, about 1,000 years ago, he did something very important in music. He gave pitches names. Prior to that, they didn't have names. They used to work with these symbols called neumes, N-E-U-M-E-S, which told you the direction that the melody was going, but it didn't tell you how far it was going up or down. So if I want to learn a song, I have to ask you to sing it to me. And then those neumes would help me remember that to go up or down. But he gave the notes the names. The names that he gave them were the do-re-mi system, the solfege system, which was called Harmonization. And he was Italian, so it was sort of handed down to us as a tradition that Italian was the official language. But a couple of centuries later, another guy from Italy by the name of Franco de Colone did something very important. You see, what he did was he gave the pitches different shapes. And those shapes told you how long to hold the notes. That was very important. He was an Italian too. So it became a tradition that Italian was spoken because these guys were Italian. But it doesn't have to be that way. You know, Wagner was German. He never used Italian. I mean, he used, if he wanted to write adagio, he'd write langsam, the German word. If you're English speaking, instead of presto, you can write fast as hell. Now, I must tell you, I use this book in my college class. I teach a course called Fundamentals of Music. I meet the class 13 weeks, once a week, 3 hours a shot. And while I crack a lot of jokes and have a lot of fun, I'm also very strict. I have a no absence policy. If they're absent even once, I tell them, they cannot get an A even if they stand on their head. So of course I reduce the absences. You cannot miss 3 hours in the sequence of learning and hope that you're going to do well in this course. I teach them beginning level piano, G clef, one passage in the right hand, F clef. They play for me every day. Middle of the semester, they play for my Razzle Dazzle book, 2 hands at the same time. They work out of theory books by Tom Manoff, excellent books called The Music Kit. I find it's organized just for a great semester, and it's an excellent book, The Music Kit, Tom Manoff. I teach them, out of that book, major scales, right off the bat, intervals, transposition, they learn right off the bat. They learn minor scales. They learn triads, all qualities, major, minor, diminished, augmented. they learn 7 chords. I even go beyond by teaching in the Roman system a little bit to tell them what to expect if they take a second semester. Because the students have learned the major scales and intervals and by the 7th week, I insist that this piece from the Learn to Compose book on page 15 be in a major key, because they know what it means now. What does that mean? Well, it means I have to choose a key signature. Let's say they're in F major, it has to be 1 flat. At the very least, I want that last note of the piece to be an F. I want it to be an atomic tone, even if the rest of the piece doesn't sound F majorish. And there should be a few A's around that F so that you can hear the relationship of the first to the third note of the scale, so you hear the tonality expressed. At the end of the semester, I asked them to write in a minor key because they've already learned what minor keys are about. So they choose F minor. The key signature has to be 4 flats has to be represented. I want at the very least for the last note to be an F, and there should be a few A flats around so you hear that minor third. They bring this piece to me week 7. I have them composing at the 2nd session. After 3 hours of meeting, they're already working on this book. So they bring the piece to me week 7. I sit at the piano and play the piece for them. Everybody stands around in the class, and I say, what's wrong with this piece in the right-hand part of measure 4? And somebody might look and say, well, her time signature says 4/4, but she's got 5 beats in that measure. You know, things of that nature, or the rest is on the wrong line, or whatever. And now I use this opportunity when I provide the critique to teach more sophisticated concepts that are not taught by the book. For example, if the student writes a group of notes that are played legato, I say, well, this is a little musical sentence. How about indicating that it's a musical sentence by putting a phrase mark over it, a slur? And I teach them to use articulation marks like staccatos and accents and so on. And you remember what I told you about how I want the beats to be in vertical alignment when they're writing piano music and so on, all the things that I spoke about earlier. They take the piece home after I provide the critique, and they bring it back to me week 8, the next meeting, corrected and improved. And that is their first term paper. Big grade, big part of their grade. At the end of the semester, they bring their piece to me week 12. And this page does not say it has to be in a major key, but I say, and in the back of the book, it does not say that the piece has to be in a minor key, but I say it, because they've already learned what that means. And week 12, they bring the piece to me, I play it, provide a critique, everybody stands around, we collectively provide the critique, they bring the piece back to me week 13, the last meeting of the semester, corrected, improved, that's their second term paper. Now, if you look at the last couple of pages, page 20, it says, compose a piece of any length using compositional devices learned in this book plus any others with which you may experiment. Well, what have they learned in this book? Repetition, sequence, retrograde, and inversion. But on pages 22 and 23, I have some additional compositional techniques. For those students who have a little more pizzazz, they might try to get into this. However, the material of pages 22 and 23 of this appendix is presented at a slower pace in the follow-up book. So you're going to experience it anyway when you take the follow-up book. Now, I must tell you, this book came out in 1987, Learn to Compose book. And I've been talking about it at workshops for the last 20 years. Sometimes in a workshop, I get the sense that 1 or 2 teachers in the audience is saying under their breath, maybe your students can do this, but mine can't. I want you to know that you don't have even one student who you work with who can't compose if you've given the data that they put into it. I want to show you something that came to my attention. There's a teacher by the name of Rona Hodge who in 1987 taught her students how to compose using this book as soon as it came out. And she took the best or the favorite composition of each student. She put it in a binder. This binder, she sent me a copy of this binder. She put a copy of this book on every chair, and the students gave a recital at which they played only their own compositions. And all the audience was able to follow the composition. This says Opus 87, Piano Compositions by students of Rona Hodgson, May, June 1987, Riverside, California. In 1988, she called her book Opus 88. I would like to show you some of these student compositions. And I have duplicated them in that free book that you're taking home called Topics in Jazz and Musical Creativity. If you please open that book to page 27, you'll see the first of several compositions created by our students.
Which book is that in?
That's page 27. So on page 27 is a piece called A Night Song Mystery by Andy Steger. He writes 9 3/4 age. Using, at the bottom of the page, he writes that he's using motive, repetition, retrograde, and sequence. The teacher did not tell him what key to work in. He chose G minor. She did not tell him what meter to use. He chose 6/4. I'm going to analyze this as I play it for you. Motive, repetition, motive, retrograde, motive, sequence, coda. Is that not a wonderful achievement? All your students can do this. Now, I would have praised him had he been my student, praised him to the sky, but I also would have pointed out certain flaws. For example, I'd said, Andy, the last note in the left hand should have an up stem, not a down stem. 2 bars from the end in the right hand, that dotted half note in the right hand, I can't tell if it's on the line or a space. You have to clarify that. Moreover, 3rd line notes in contemporary grading get down stem, not up stem. 3 bars from the end, there are 2 notes that should have down stems, that have up stems. And the first note in the bar, I can't tell if it's on the line or a space. There's no tempo mark at the top of the page. In measures 1 and 2, the whole rests are correctly placed under the 4th staff line, but nowhere else in the piece is the whole rest correctly located. So you're going to find a lot of things that you can clarify with your students and help them. But I'm telling you, it's so easy to teach them to compose, and they're going to love the experience. Now, I would like to hold up to you 2 books that you do not have at your seats. And then I'll tell you why I wrote them. This is an introduction to 16th notes, book 1 and 2. In this book, all the time signatures have 4 as the bottom number. In this follow-up book, most of the time signatures have 4 and 8, alternately 4 and 8. These 2 books have classical repertoire that we played when we were kids by Bach, Kavalevsky, Schumann, Couperin. Also has rock and jazz materials. The reason I wrote these books is to get your students to be introduced to 16th notes earlier. Publishers have done a great disservice to the teaching community and to students by slowing the students' learning process down. What they do is they put out book 1A repertoire, book 1A method, book 1A hymns, book 1A Christmas. By the time the student's ready for book 1B, he's ready to get married. They take too long to get to various, because they want to sell more books at each given level. So here's my contribution to getting your student to be introduced to 16th notes earlier, and then clap and count exercises there too. Now, Dr. Martha Baker, who everybody calls Marty, and I have composed 5 books together. And these are 2 of them. Learn to harmonize and transpose, beginning level, and that's the follow-up early intermediate level book. In the red book, the beginning level book, Learn to Harmonize and Transpose, we teach the student how to harmonize using only the 1, 4, and 5, 7 chords, using what we call the common tone system. Common tone system means any note that you're using in your right hand for melody becomes a note that you can use in your left hand for a chord. Because if you're using the same notes, it's going to sound compatible. Now, the setup for this book appears on pages 2 and 3, where we have a melody. First, we define what harmonization means, which means playing a melody with one hand and adding chords in the other. And then we say, play this melody. Circle the highest and lowest notes, because those outline the 5-finger pattern, which we then ask the student to play. And using the common tone system, extract from that pattern the first, third, and fifth notes, and here you have your tonic triad. We then ask the student to play the tonic triad on a downbeat of every 2/4 bar. On top of page 3, a chord on every beat instead. And in more of a jazz manner, chords on the weak beats. For transposition, we ask the student to start that same melody on a different note, duplicate all the intervals that were present in the original, go through that same pattern, same procedure that you went through, and then you'll notice that all the transposition opportunities in this book are either a second above or a second below. But we would like to encourage you to do more distant transpositions, a third above, a fourth above, a fifth below. Please do not take the attitude that the student is not ready for it yet. Don't judge your student's ability to learn. They have sponges for brains. Don't judge your student's ability to learn on the basis of our ability as adults. When we slow down from the age of 5, we get worse, not better. And we say they're not ready for it. But let me tell you something, they're ready for it in most cases. The worst that'll happen is you'll have to back up a little bit. I'd rather make the mistake of going too fast and backing up when I need to, and going too slow and making the process boring for both of us. Now if you look at page 16 of this book, you'll see there are 4 melodies that your students will be able to harmonize at sight using the common tone system and applying the 1, 4, and 5, 7 chords. This follow-up book, Harmonizing and Transposing at the Piano Early Intermediate Level, introduces the 2/7 chord. Now think about it. The 2/7 chord in the key of C is a D minor 7 chord. Right? Aren't there 3 notes in this chord, F, A, C, that constitute the 4 chord? 2/7 and the 4 chord contain 3 notes that are identical. Because of that, you may use one chord instead of the other. That's called chord substitution. And we talk about that briefly here. But at the end of the book, we introduce the idea of playing from chord symbols, alphabetical chord symbols that you find in popular sheet music and fake books. Here on page 21. It says up to this point, it says we have used Roman numerals to identify chords. However, most popular sheet music uses alphabetical symbols instead of Romans. So here is Old Lang Syne, fake book lead sheet style. Did you notice that my chords are a mixture of root positions and inversions? I achieve smooth voice leading that way. I'm just going to play the chords for you. I can tell I'm using good voice leading because my hand is not even moving. So I don't have any leaps. It's all stationary and stepwise motion. When this book was finished, I called my co-author, Marty Baker, and I said, Marty, those last 4 pages can be expanded into an entire book. I had just finished writing an article for Clavier, which they published, which is in your Topics in Jazz book, called Understanding Chord Symbols. And I said, how about, Marty, you coming to New York for a weekend, and I'll come to California for a weekend. We'll work out what should be in this book. And we came out with the book that I described to you earlier as the second most important book in this room today, How to Play Chord Symbols in Jazz and Popular Music. By the way, Tony Caramia, do you know that name? In his most recent article in Keyboard Companion, called this the best book of its type on the market. I don't want to sound immodest, but I'd like to say about it. In the foreword, it tells you in the very first sentence you should play from this book. It says, this book may be used by students who know intervals, major and minor scales in 1 octave, and can play major and minor triads and reposition and inversions. Wouldn't you agree that that's intermediate level? The contents, next 2 pages, you'll see that the book is divided into 2 parts. Basic chords from triads up to and including 7 chords constitute the first part. The second part of the book goes into extended chords, such as 9th, 11th, and 13th. The setup for this book appears on pages 6 and 7. At the top of the page, it says a fake book lead sheet is a kind of musical shorthand consisting of a melody plus alphabetical chord symbols. And there, as a lead sheet, is Drink to Me Only with Thine Eyes, but I don't have the lyrics to the song there, just the chord symbols, the alphabetical symbols, and the melody. Underneath it says the alphabet letter of a chord symbol always indicates the chord root. So a major triad is represented by a capital letter. Capital C means C major. A dominant 7th chord is a capital letter plus the number 7 next to it. It says, however, F/C indicates an F chord played with C as the bottom note of the chord. On the top of page 7, I talk about dominant seventh chords in two ways. Dominant, as you know, means 5. The dominant tone of the scale is the 5th note of the scale. So if I were to play diatonic seventh chords, that is to say, using only the notes of the scale, if I'm in C major, I'll use only white notes. So diatonic seventh chords, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 4-note chord built on the 5th note of the scale is called dominant seventh. It's called dominant because it's built on the 5th note of the scale. It's called seventh because it has the interval of a seventh by virtue of the presence of the 4th note in that chord. But it's also dominant seventh in another way. It's dominant seventh in quality. You see, a dominant seventh chord has a major triad and a minor seventh. So I can tell my student to play, let's say, A flat 7. The student doesn't have to say to me, what key are we in? I want to figure out what the 5th note of the scale is. The student says, A flat 7. That means it's a dominant seventh chord, which means it's a major triad and a minor seventh. Here's your dominant seventh chord, A flat 7. So you can be dominant seventh by virtue of the position in the scale, or dominant seventh by virtue of the quality of the chord. In the middle of page 7, it says, number 1, play and memorize the following lead sheet chords using the left hand. Throughout this book, by memorize, we mean the ability to play the chords by looking at the symbols only, not the notes under the symbols. And it says, suggestion to the teacher, after sufficient study time, cover up those notes so the student can only read the symbols. Because I want the student to respond to the symbols. In the fake book, there are not going to be those notes written out. It's just going to be symbols. When the student sees F/C, I want the student to know that he or she is playing an F chord in second inversion. At the bottom of page 7 is the realization of the lead sheet on page 6. Now, this is the setup. Let me show you a typical page in the book, page 8. It's a 3-step process. The first step, play and memorize those left-hand chords. Cover them up, though, so the student can only read the symbols, not the notes, after sufficient study, of course. Second step, practice the right hand by itself. Third step, 2 hands together. This is a book of keyboard harmony, in which the raison d'etre, the reason for the existence of the book, is the ability to play from alphabetical chord symbols so that you can go out and play from the fake book. This book moves rapidly, but not unreasonably so. And any student getting through this book will be able to play from any fake book ever written, including those lousy ones that were written when I was a kid. When the time comes, well, let me first tell you. I wrote a book called Jazz Keyboard Harmony that I believe is going out of print soon. It's been out for a quarter of a century. And I'm now taking some of this material, especially the material pertaining to chord substitution, to reharmonization, and I'm writing another book that'll be called Chord Substitution in Jazz, but I'm only halfway through the book yet, at the moment. But the reason I wrote this book originally, Jazz Keyboard Harmony, was because I have heard pianists play and found their playing flawed, and I wanted to correct for that. I have a strange sense of humor. I like to go to good restaurants where great food is served, but where there are terrible pianists playing. I want to hear what they're doing. I play a mind game with myself. Say, if this were my student, in the first 5 minutes of the first lesson, how can I transform his play? There are 2 things that they do wrong. One thing is they play too many chords in root positions. When you play a chord in root position, it sounds as though the music has stopped. That's the last chord of the piece. But if you play a chord in an inversion, it sounds as though you have to go through a series of chords to get to root position. So you stop the motion when you play root position, you create motions by playing chords in inversion. Another thing is the basic triad tones, called rest tones in the classical texts, and rightly so, because they don't feel as though they have to go anywhere. But if you take any other tone in the scale from which that chord has been derived, and combine it with those rest tones, it creates a tension that suggests that you have to move somewhere. Let me show you what one of these pianists sounds like when they play too many rest tones and too few motion tones. when you play too many root positions. That's not even easy to do. A more adept pianist would avoid root positions, whether there's a bass player playing the root notes or not, and would play a lot of motion tones that may or may not resolve. That's the difference between one player and another, is the degree of dissonance you get without resolution. There's my first root position, and even though my resolution chord, I have a tension, because I don't like a plain vanilla triad. I might use one every 10 years for shock value. In this book that I'm going to take out of this book this information on chord substitution or reharmonization that I want to talk to you about now. Some of this information is in the Topics in Jazz free book that you take me home. I have an article there that Clavier published years ago on chord improvisation. And a few months ago, Clavier magazine published an article of mine on one of the techniques that I'm going to describe to you now in this segment. It's called parallel chromatic motion, but it also has another name that I'll tell you about in a couple of minutes. What I want to show you now, if I pick up a piece of sheet music from that store next door and I play it on a gig, I'll never be asked to come back and play that job again, because the music is written in a very simplistic manner. I'm using the word simplistic in a pejorative manner. It's written for the lowest common denominator. And when you play it, if you're a professional, you will not sound like a professional. So jazz musicians use a couple of techniques especially to enhance the harmonies of their piece. I'd like to show you some of those techniques. The first one I will show you is called circle of fifths substitution. Well, the circle of fifths, if you go clockwise through the circle of fifths, you're going up the scale in perfect fifths. And each one of these keys has one sharp in the key signature more than the preceding one. If you go counterclockwise, you're going down the scale in perfect fifths. And each one of these keys has one flat in the key signature more than the preceding one. Now, if you want to find the dominant of any point on this circle, you always go clockwise. Dominant of C is G, dominant of B flat is F. Always clockwise for the dominant. To find the secondary dominant, which is the dominant of the dominant, you're going still further clockwise. Tonic, dominant, secondary dominant. And note that the secondary dominant is the second note of the tonic scale. Now I'm going to come back and show you the relevance of this information in a couple of minutes. But let me show you the formula for chord substitution, circle of fifths chord substitution. I find a stretch of music that I deem to be inferior with respect to its harmonies, and I say I'm going to change these harmonies. I'll call the next chord the destination chord. That's my harmonic goal. Let's say, for argument's sake, it's C. I'll go backwards from it, clockwise through the circle of fifths to find the dominant of it, place it in front of it. Then I'll go further backwards, further clockwise. I don't even have to look here because I know that the secondary dominant is going to be the second note of that scale. But instead of playing D7, I'm going to change it to minor, play D minor 7, and I'm going to tell you why I do that. If I were to play diatonic 7 chords in the key of, in the major scale, the 2 chord is minor. So jazz musicians have a tendency to play their secondary dominance as minor. They can also do it as a dominant, but they usually do it as minor. Now, in a minor key, what happens if you play diatonic 7 chords in a minor key? C minor is 3 flats, B flat, E flat, A flat. 2 chord is not only minor, but it's a minor 7th with a flat of 5th. C minor 7, that's a minor 7 with a flat of 5th. Also called half diminished 7. Half diminished 7. Now that's crazy. because there's nothing half diminished about a half diminished seventh. A diminished chord contains 3 minor thirds. Right? Diminished seventh chord? A so-called half diminished seventh contains only 2 minor thirds and a major third. So it should be 2/3 diminished. It's a misnomer. But you know, the jazz musicians created that expression, and the classical musicians did a crazy thing. They started using the same term. But what you have to know is that a so-called half diminished chord is really a minor seventh chord with a flat fifth. And in the progression, it goes D minor 7 flat 5, 2 7 flat 5, 2 5 7 G7 to C minor. The major key is. These chords function in a progression. We're talking functional harmony here. When Mozart played this, you knew sooner or later, probably sooner rather, it went here. And it's the same with these chords. They all function in a relationship, in a progression. So this is the formula. By the way, I'm reading Mozart's biography, and it's just so wonderful. I have it in my suitcase. But the biography has been derived from letters. He and his father wrote extensive letters to one another and to other people, and it's just a wonderful experience to read that. To read about life in those days. I wish I could think of the author. You know, I have it in my car. It's right outside the front door. Afterwards, I'll tell you what it is.
There's so many books about it.
Yes, there are, but this is a more recent one. It's been highly praised. And you know who told me about it? You know the name David Duval?
Yeah.
He teaches at Juilliard. He's got a radio show in New York called The Piano in Comparative Performance. Reflections from the Keyboard, the Piano in Comparative Performance. But his course is called The World of the Piano. And I take that course every Tuesday. I go there at 5:30. For 2 hours, I hear Juilliard students and Manhattan School of Music students playing, and he talks about the music, he talks about the composers, and he tells jokes, and he knows history. He can tell you a particular day that Mozart had coffee and where he had the coffee. I tell you, it's so fantastic. I just love it. It's the most greatest experience. Well, let me go back to this. Let's say I go to the store and I get the song T for 2. 2 beats of B flat minor 7, 2 beats of E flat 7. That's all repeated, then A flat major for 8 beats, and then B flat minor 7. T for 2. By the way, if I had written that song, I wouldn't have to work for a living. Now, I think that 2 bars of the same chord is potentially dull. So I say I'm going to change these chords in these 2 bars. I'll call the next chord the destination chord. In my mind, it's a 1 chord. I'll work backwards from it, go clockwise through the circle of fifths, find the dominant of that, which is F7. I'll put it here. And then I'll go further backwards, further clockwise, find the secondary dominant. I don't even have to look here, because I know it's here, the second note of that scale. C7, but instead of playing it at C7, I'll change it to minor, C minor 7, and now I have a 2/7 to 5/7 to 1 progression. When I get to this bar, I'll play C minor 7, F7 instead of the chord above it. And then I enrich the harmony that way. Now, I was able to do that because my right hand notes and my left hand notes corresponded. Sometimes the best jazz musician will reach for that chord substitution, will find that there's a clash between the melody note and that pattern, chord pattern. So what the adept pianist will do is to change the melody to match the chord to which he's already committed himself, like this. With a little self-confidence, and that comes very quickly. You feel that you can change the melody notes. You know, there's nothing inviolable about popular music melodies as there is in classical music. You can't change the classical melody, but you can in popular music. In fact, popular music is intended to be changed and interpreted differently. I don't have to stop here. I can call this last chord that I chose my new destination chord. In my brain, it's my new 1 chord. I'll go backwards from it, clockwise through the circle of fifths, find the dominant of C, which is G7. Find the secondary dominant, made minor, second note of that scale, made minor, D minor 7. And now when I get to this bar, I'll play D minor 7, G7 instead of the chord above it. And now I sound like a pro. Now you ask the pros who can do this, how they do it, and you know what they say? I don't know, man. They know how to do it because they're copying each other, but they don't know the theory. But you know the theory, even if you've never done it before, you now know the theory. Let me show you another piece to apply this formula to another piece. This is the chord pattern for a piece of music called I Can't Get Started by Vernon Duke, words by Ira Gershwin. Sounds like this. It's beautiful the way it is, but if I wanted to enhance the harmonies in the first bar, I would say I'm going to change these harmonies, call the next chord the destination chord, would be my one chord in my brain, go backwards from it, find the dominant of D, which is A7. Secondary dominant, E minor 7, make it minor, right, E minor 7. My new destination chord, go backwards, clockwise through the circle, find the dominant of E, which is B7. Secondary dominant, made minor, go clockwise, second note of that scale, F sharp, make it minor, F sharp minor 7. So instead of the original, which sounds isn't that fantastic? Is that easy to do? Mm-hmm. Absolutely easy. Let me show you another piece of music to apply the same formula. It is so formulaic, it's a joke. It's like a math formula. Now, I'm going to show you another piece from which a couple of pedagogical principles may be derived. This is the chord pattern for a very famous song called Sweet Georgia Brown. Well, 4 bars of each of these chords is a little much. So I say to myself, F7 is the dominant of B flat. What's the secondary dominant of B flat? Second note of B flat scale? C. Change it to minor, C minor 7. Before you play the F7, you play C minor 7. So now you have a 2-7 to 5-7 pattern. B flat 7 is the dominant of E flat. What's the secondary dominant? F. Made minor, F. I'll play F minor 7 before I play this chord. What's the E flat 7 is the dominant of A flat. What chord? B flat minor 7.
But you don't keep it the same dialogue.
Well, let's see. Instead of this, I'll do this. I might not want that much harmonic motion. I might modify it. I said there were a couple of pedagogical principles that you can learn from this. One is, if you have one of those old fake books with lousy chord progressions, and you have a dominant 7th chord that doesn't come from anywhere interesting harmonically, think of it as a 5-7 chord, put the 2-7 in front of it, it'll always work.
What?
If you have a dominant 7th chord, put the 2-7 chord in front of it. Make it minor, but put it in front of it, it'll always work. You'll always be able to play them consecutively. The converse is also true. If you have a minor 7th chord in your book and it doesn't go anywhere interesting, think of it as a 2-7 chord, and put the 5-7 after it, it'll always work. So if you have this chord, this should go in front of it. If you have this chord, this should go after it. Now, I'd like to show you a different substitution technique using the same song, and then I will combine the two techniques in one. Before I show it to you, I have to show you the aural, A-U-R-A-L, phenomenon that makes it possible to do this. Did you hear the next pattern in your ear that I didn't play? Yes, because when I play sequences, I create motion, you hear the next pattern in that sequence. You hear it, right? Now how about, you hear it. I create motion when I play chords in parallel chromatic motion. So let's use that motion-producing property to enrich the harmony here. Before I play B flat 7, I will approach it chromatically from above by first playing B7, or approach it chromatically from below by first playing A7. Before I play E flat 7, I'll approach it chromatically from above by first playing E7, or from below by first playing B7. I'm going to play this piece for you two ways now. This way, and then this way. Now the other way. Jazz musicians have a preference. They would rather use this chord than this one. Right? Now, let me show you something about that. F7 to B flat is your traditional dominant seven tonic harmony, Mozartian harmony. The jazz musician maintains that this chord offers as much pull to that chord as this chord. Let's see if that's true, and if so, why? F7, B7. Yes. Why? Because of the leading tone, the seventh note of the scale. That's what does the pulling. Jazz musicians have a name for this. They actually have two names for this. We call this parallel chromatic motion. And they often substitute this chord for this chord to sound more modern. Now, once you have a dominant seventh chord, if you go 3 whole steps, either up or down, you'll wind up on this note. 3 whole steps is called a tritone. So this chord is referred to as a tritone substitute. You can either call this technique parallel chromatic motion or tritone substitute. Let's practice some of those. You're playing from one of those old fake books that sound dated. The last 2 chords of the piece are G7C. Well, that sounds like Mozart, but it doesn't sound like Dizzy Gillespie. If you want to sound modern, what's the tritone substitute for the G7? What's 3 whole steps away from G? C sharp, but I'm going to call it D flat because I'm going to make it move down instead of. Okay. Let's say you're in the key of F major. The last 2 chords are C7, F. What's the tritone substitute for the C7? What's 3 whole steps away from C? 3 whole steps away from C? Yes, but I'm going to call it G flat because I'm going to make it move down. So instead of C7, F, I'll play G flat F. By the way, the tritone substitute is a half step higher than where you go. Okay? Now let's take, you're in the key of G major. 5, 7, 1 in G major. D7, G. What should I use instead of the D7? No.
G.
No. What's a half step away from D? 3 whole steps away from D. A flat. That's your tritone substitute. Jazz musicians do that all the time. I did this article for Clavier a few months ago. It might be about 6 or 8 months ago on this very subject. If you email or contact Judy Nelson, the editor of Clavier, and ask her for that article, I can't even remember what we called it, what she called it. You know, you submit an article with a title and they change the title. So I don't remember what they call it. But it talks about this subject very, very succinctly and adequately. Let me show you how to combine these 2 techniques in one. I'm going to put on the board a chord pattern of a very famous song, standard, by Jerome Kern, called All the Things You Are. Now, I see a dominant seventh chord. That means I can use tritone substitute. What's 3 whole steps away from E flat 7? What's three whole steps away from E flat? A. I'll play A7 instead of E flat 7. This, now, I can call this either tritone substitute, or I can call it parallel chromatic motion, as I said before. Now, I said, if you have a dominant seventh chord, you can put the secondary dominant A minor in front of it. So before I play the A7, that's the 5/7, I'll put the 2/7. A7 is a dominant of D. What's the secondary dominant of D? Second note of the D scale. It's E. I'll play E minor 7 before I play the A7. So here's your circle of fifth substitution. Parallel chromatic motion or tritone substitution. I'm going to play this piece for you 3 ways now. This way, a little later in jazz history, and much later in jazz history. Here we go. Is that great? It's just a little formula. If you apply the formula, it's foolproof. You can't go wrong. Folks, when the time comes for me to finish with my work on this planet, I know what they're going to do with me. They're going to put me down there and then put a stone over me with the name and dates. But instead of that, if they would just print the cover of this book on a stone, I'll stand on its merits as my most scholarly book. Modes and their use in jazz. When I wanted to write a book about how Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock and McCoy Tyner, today's greatest jazz pianists, how they use modes, I realized that I couldn't write such a book unless I first described how modes were used, not in a jazz context, but rather in the context of folk music and liturgical music. So this book became a book about modes, big letters, modes, and oh, by the way, and their use in jazz. Throughout the book are scattered references to jazz. Now, modes in the larger perspective are scales. Major mode, minor mode, pentatonic mode. But in the narrower sense, modes are scales that were used as the basis of medieval church music, Gregorian plain chant, 6th century. Those modes had Greek names. They were diatonic, that is to say, they had 5 whole steps, 2 half steps. They used the next letter of the alphabet to describe the next note. They used the next staff line or space without repeating or omitting. That's the definition of diatonic. And these modes could be described, as you see on pages 4 and 5, by just using the white keys of the piano. And most people can tell what mode they're in by where the half steps are. Even if they're working with black keys and white keys together, if they can figure out what the scale is, they see where the half steps are, they know what the mode is. C to C, white keys of the piano, half steps between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. This is known as the Ionian mode, handed down to us over the centuries as the major scale. Composers started to use the major scale in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And in fact, they started using key signatures in those days. They used to identify their pieces by what key they were in. Symphony in A major, sonata in G minor. You know, they felt that because they're using that particular scale, they should indicate what it was that formed the basis of their composition. If I go D to D using white keys of the piano, the half steps are now between 2 and 3 and 6 and 7. So if you create a scale, and you can figure out that the half steps are between 2 and 3 and 6 and 7, you know it's Dorian mode. Phrygian mode, E to E, white keys of the piano. A rather strange mode because it has a half step relationship between the first and second note. Spanish music is built on the Phrygian mode. That's why Spanish music sounds, that's why Phrygian sounds Spanish. But it also sounds Jewish. It also sounds Hungarian. sounds the way it sounds because of the scale it's built upon. F to F is Lydian. Half steps in a different place. G to G, strange mode because it has that whole step between 7 and 8. Latin music is Mixolydian. Aeolian, known as the natural minor scale, handed down to us as the natural minor scale. Contemporary composers did not like it. Contemporary, last 3 centuries, they didn't like that scale. Or that other way. And then I'll show you where it is, what I'm doing on the board, where it is in the book. If I go C to C using white keys of the piano, the tonic tone of the key signature of no sharps, no flats is C. But the last tone of the mode, in this case, is also C. All modal music, except in jazz, ends on the last note of the mode, which is called the fundamental tone of the mode. And there's a relationship between the fundamental tone of the mode and the tonic, and I call that the transposition interval. In this case, it's the unison. If I go D to D using white keys of the piano, D is now the fundamental tone of the mode. C is the tonic. I'm still using white keys of the piano, so I'm still in the key of C major. This is now from here to here, a major second down. By the way, the modes do not take their name from the tonic tone, they take it from the fundamental tone. So in the key of C major, the Dorian mode is known as D Dorian. C Ionian, D Dorian. If I go E to E using white keys of the piano, fundamental tone is E, tonic is still C, white keys of the piano, major third down to get from here to here. The Phrygian mode in the key of C is known as E Phrygian. F to F is F Lydian. F is the fundamental tone, C is the tonic, still using white keys of the piano, perfect fourth down to get from here to here. G to G is G Mixolydian. G is the fundamental tone, C is the tonic, still using white keys, perfect fifth down to get from here to here. A to A is A Aeolian, sometimes spelled without the E in it. A is the fundamental tone, C is the tonic, major sixth down to get from here to here. B Locrian would be the B to B scale. B is the fundamental tone, C is the tonic, still using white keys, major seventh down to get from here to here. So let's see what this means. Instead of playing all these modes starting on a different note, I'm going to play them starting on the same note and see what the thinking process is. C Ionian, that's a no-brainer, that's C major scale. Now C Dorian, what's the transposition interval for the Dorian mode? Major second down. What's a major second down from C? B flat. I'll play the B flat major scale, but start on C. There's my C Dorian. C Phrygian, major third down. What's a major third down from C? A flat. I'll play the A flat major scale, start on C. There's my C Phrygian. C Lydian. What scale would I play starting on C to play C Lydian? Perfect fourth down from C is G. C Mixolydian, what scale do I play starting on C? Perfect fifth down from C is F. C Aeolian, major sixth down from C is E flat. C Locrian, major seventh down from C is D flat. So I play the scales in that order with that thinking process. C, B flat, D flat, G, F, E flat, D flat. That's hard as hell. By the way, on page, what I did on the board is on page 5 in a slightly different format. And by the way, the scales that I just played are on page 19 in that order. Now, I have, every one of these scales has a note in it. If you go to page 15, every one of these scales has a note in it that sounds sort of an odd note. Some people facetiously refer to it as the wrong note. What it is the characteristic mode tone. If you look at, for example, the C Lydian, which is the G major scale starting on C, doesn't it sound as though that's a wrong note? It sounds like the C characteristic mode tone of the Lydian mode is that of the major scale with a raised fourth. Anytime I want to sound Lydian, I play the tones of the major scale and do the raised fourth. Let's look at I have 7 pieces in the back of the book, each piece in a different mode. Let's look at my Lydian piece on page 42. In measure 1, I use the tones of the C major scale, F sharp, raised fourth. Second system on that page, second bar, B flat major scale, E is the raised fourth. Page 43, second bar, A flat major with a raised fourth is D. Third system, first bar, E flat major, A is a raised fourth. Next bar, G flat major, C is a raised fourth. Next bar, A major, D sharp is a raised fourth. Last chord on that line is A flat major, D is a raised fourth. Last chord of the piece, D flat major, got a G in it, that's your raised fourth. Ask your students to write a Lydian piece. It's easy. Major scale tones, raise the fourth note. You've got it. Now, I haven't talked yet to you about how jazz musicians use modes. 1957 and 8, a guy by the name of Miles Davis, you know that name? Wonderful trumpet player, had what is to this day still considered to be the best small jazz group ever in the history of jazz. He had Bill Evans, the pianist in the band. He had John Coltrane, the saxophone player in the band. They were the first jazz musicians to ever play modal jazz. Of course, modal music existed way before he ever did that. But he was the first to apply it to, or among the first to apply it to the jazz idiom. What he did was he would take a mode, let's say C Dorian, which would be the B flat major scale starting on C. He would find a chord that was compatible with it by taking the first, third, fifth, and seventh notes of that scale, common tone system, and he would only play those 7 different notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 8th note's the same as the first. There are 5 chromatic tones that you're not allowed to use, otherwise you weaken the modality. You can only use them as embellishing tones. So you play that chord and only those 7 different notes. But Davis realized that that could be boring because there's no harmonic motion. So he said, let's take the elevator down, transpose the whole thing down a whole step, and play B flat Dorian, that's A flat major scale, with the B flat minor 7. So now I have C Dorian with C minor 7, B flat Dorian with B flat minor 7, and alternate. That was the most novel, fresh way to play jazz in the last half century. It was a wonderful touch. If you ever want to hear modal jazz played by Miles Davis, he has an album that he made a half century ago that still sells big. It's called Kind of Blue. And there's one particular song in there called So What that is Dorian mode. There's a book that you have in your packet called Learning to Improvise Jazz Accompaniments that has lesson plans provided for it by the teacher's manual, Take 10 for Jazz. As you see on page 3, I work with blues structure, and I work with the blues scale. And at the bottom of page 3, it talks about the 4 functions of an accompaniment. The first function would be to indicate the harmony. Another function would be to give music its rhythmic definition. A third function would be the opportunity to fill periods of melodic inactivity. And the fourth function would be the opportunity for an accompaniment to provide contrapuntal material. Now, on page 4, I have a melody that consists exclusively of chord tones, and I combine it with these chords, which actually, in my first case, doesn't provide rhythm, it just is sustained. So it's just providing harmony. Show rhythm, I have to make the chord pulse. If I pulse on strong beats, it's not going to sound jazzy. if I pulse on weak beats, as I do on the top of page 5, it sounds more like popular music. And then at the bottom of page 5, I show that I can create a jazz effect by doing an anticipation of beat 3. 1, 2, and 3, 4. Charleston, that's all it is. Anticipated third beat. Delay of the third beat, page 6. 1, 2, 3. And I finally combine all those techniques in one accompaniment at the bottom of page 6. That consists exclusively of chord tones, and I ask the student to create an accompaniment that combines those techniques. Now, starting on page 8, every succeeding melody contains one blue note more than the preceding one, so my melodies become progressively more interesting because of the presence of the blue notes. Now, if you look at page 10, you'll see I talk about accompaniment as a fill-in. If I'm playing with a small combo, that combo consists usually of a drummer. I can't play the drum part on the piano. Usually a bass player, there's no point in my duplicating the bass player's notes, and usually a melody instrument like a trumpet, no point in my playing the melody notes. So what's left for me to do as the pianist? Except fill in, like this. And I stay out of everybody's way and never mind playing about it. Now, when I was 14, I'd been playing piano 9 years. I had a wonderful technique, and I used to play in summer resorts. My mother used to send me to the Catskill Mountains to play in bands all summer. She didn't send me to get band experience, but rather she sent me to get rid of me for the summer. And I played in what was known as the Borscht Belt. That's the Catskill Mountain summer resorts that the Russian Jews used to go to, and they used to like to drink borscht, so they got that name, Borscht Belt. And I used to play with bands, and of course I played too many notes. Musicians hated to play with me. It wasn't until later on that I learned that one should economize when playing with a band. But even if I had known that I should economize when I was 14, with all those hormones raging, I don't know that I'd have been able to do that. On page 11, I have a piece that I say to the pianist, pretend that the right hand is the band, and your left hand is you, and you're only going to play when the band is not playing. What's more economical than silence? If you look at the next page, I ask that there be at least 2 beats of simultaneous silence between the melody and the chords. You know, he's a wonderful model for jazz teaching because he plays with such economy of style. He's a much better model for jazz pedagogy than Oscar Peterson, who is by far the better pianist. That great Canadian jazz pianist who was the follower, the next in line after Art Tatum. By the way, those chord substitution techniques that I talked about earlier were things that Art Tatum used to do. Art Tatum is known and is recognized in the jazz history books as probably the greatest jazz pianist who ever lived, but he's not given nearly as much credit as he should be given for being a pioneer in chord substitution and harmonization. That was his major contribution in my estimation. If you're going to use a model among the pros, go with Count Basie rather than Oscar Peterson. How many of your students can play with an Oscar Peterson technique anyway? Not too many. Now, in your next packet, I have the first book that I ever wrote called Jazz Flavored Scale Patterns and Exercises. I took the 36, by the way, I showed you the Japanese cover of this book earlier. I took the 36 scales that we always practice, major, melodic minor, and harmonic minor, and I present each one of them in this book in 2 octaves with traditional classical fingering. I have that on page 6. You should be looking at packet 4. Now, right after each scale, I have a little jazz essay that contains that scale in at least 1 octave ascending and 1 octave descending. So this book, even if you didn't practice the scales and you just practice if you just practice the jazz exercises, you're practicing the scales. But ideally, you should practice both. The reason that I wrote this book is because I was tortured for years by practicing scales. But I'll tell you, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Because that is so essential, so essential. But I want to make the practicing of scales more interesting. And this is the first thought that I had when I came to writing a jazz book. Another book that I have, that you have in your packet, that's part of this series, is called Jazz-Flavored Sequential Patterns and Passages. I'm not interested in sequences the way Churning and Hannon use them for the development of finger dexterity and technique. I'm interested in sequence as a compositional tool. That's the motive. That's the sequence. Sequence. That whole opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is one motive developed sequentially. By the way, he did something, Beethoven did something very interesting. Major third, minor third. He could have done, but what did he know? I have 24 pieces in this book, 12 majors and 12 minor key pieces. In each piece, I've developed motives sequentially to create a little prelude. My C minor piece contains 3 motives developed sequentially. The first 3 notes, then up a minor third, up another minor third, again. Bar 4 is a new motive. Top of the next page are several sequences. End of the second system on page 7 is a 3-note motive. Then I go up a minor third from that presentation. The sequence. So I've taken 3 motives, developed each sequentially, put them together, and I have a little prelude. I got lucky. Rock styles for piano. The second sentence of the foreword, opposite page 3, tells you what rock is. By the way, these 2 books, these 2 exercise books that I just showed you, were originally part of a 4-book series. The other 2 books, Broken Triad, Jazz-Flavored Broken Triads and Jazz-Flavored Broken Dominant 7 Chords, are out of print in America. But Japan took those 4 books and they made 1 book out of it with 4 chapters. And they told me it was selling real well. Please do a recording for it. So I just did a recording for them. It just came out just a few months ago. And that book is called Keyboard Techniques in Jazz. So if you're ever in Japan, that publisher is Sony. Keyboard Techniques in Jazz, you get all 4 books with a recording of me playing these books. This is the first book. I wrote these in 1980. Published in 1980, it's still out alive. Well, second sentence of the rock book says, rock music is thought to have begun in 1954 when elements of 3 separate areas, pop, rhythm, and blues, and country, were integrated by rock artists in their music. Among the most important elements taken from pop was the ballad style. Rhythm and blues contributed jazz and blues influences, and a strong beat, and country music added an informal folk character to that combination. I was in the Army in the mid-50s, and I sent to Alabama for a couple of years, which is pretty much culture shock for this Bronx boy. But I heard this music when I got down there, and I thought, that's Alabama music. But then I got back to New York 2 years later, and I kept hearing it, and I realized that it was a broader phenomenon than just regional music. It turned out to be the beginning of rock and roll. As you see in the first piece, I thought that triplets were being played, but it was actually 12/8 meter, and the bass player was rocking and rolling. That's my left hand. Play the swing eighths. They go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. They play the swing eighth lilt. But rock musicians never do that. Rock musicians always play straight eighths. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Shuffle. Remember this shuffle? Well, this is very similar. It has 2 bass beats to the bar. Notice the asterisk under the grace note in bar 1. Footnote at the bottom of the page. It tells you not to play the grace note before the chord, as you probably would do in classical music, but rather to combine the grace note with the top note of the chord, quickly followed by the bottom note of the chord. Floyd Kramer invented that way of playing. Says to me, Lee, I want you to sound like a country piano player in that section of the music. I take out of my bag of tricks my Floyd Kramer grace note, and it sounds just like a country piano player. I have a duet on pages 14 and 15 called Pop Rock, which means popularized rock. Barry Manilow, does that name mean anything? He's the greatest exponent of pop rock. But I must tell you that he's looked down upon by the rock purists, because he's taken a number of things out of rock that should be in it. There's no country influences, performances. There's no rhythm and blues influences. He's a very fine ballad singer with a hint of a rock beat behind it. Barry Manilow is to the rock purist what Liberace was to the classical purist. Now, I had a lot of fun with this piece. I say it's a duet, but if you don't have a partner, you can play the secondo part and whistle the primo part, which I'm doing. How about helping me whistle this? You know, I'm convinced that if you include popular and jazz materials in your teaching, You will motivate your students so that they'll want to come back for more, and you'll also be motivated yourselves. But that doesn't mean that you'll keep all your students. You may lose some even then. You know who the ones are who you lose? The bright ones, who have too many activities in their lives, they're on too many teams, they're in too many clubs. And you know who among those are the ones who drop music? The ones who grew up without music, without their parents being important, without music being an important part of their parents' lives. If they had had a mother like mine, with her iron fist, she was really tough on me. I was very lucky to have had a mother who didn't care one whit whether I liked her or not. And she made me do things that I didn't want to do, like practicing a lot rather than play ball. She wanted to be a mother, not a friend. And she really did a good job. I hope she could hear me because she did a good job with my brother and sister and me. She used to sit next to me. She was not musically trained. In Russia, when she was growing up, she didn't have the opportunity for music in her life, so she wanted her kids to have it. She used to sit next to me while I practiced every day. She mandated that I had to practice an hour a day. And she'd sit next to me, and she thought she could detect mistakes. So if I made a mistake, or she thought I made a mistake, she'd say, mistake, mistake, and I'd go over it. Now, in the middle of that hour, she used to invariably go into the kitchen to turn the oven up or down on whatever she was cooking for that evening's meal. The clock was in the kitchen. Now, when I was an adult, she confided to me that every time she went to the kitchen, she turned the clock back. So I wound up practicing an hour and a half, costed 2 hours probably. So what happened was I became a very good pianist, but now I can't tell time. I've written a series of 35 books for Hal Leonard called Lee Evans Arranges. Many of them are up there. These books were designed to be standard materials like Lee Evans Arranges, Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Harold Arlen, easy jazz standards. The books were designed to be intermediate to upper intermediate level, but to sound very professional and very improvised. The most recent book in that series is this one called Lee Evans Arranges Tin Pan Alley Standards. If I may, I'd like to play just the first piece in that book for you to give you an idea of what I'm after. Cuddle up a little closer. Jazz up his Christmas, he almost threw me out of his office because he was afraid I would alienate too many people. But I went ahead and I wrote this book, and it turned out to be one of my all-time best-selling books. Jazz Up Your Christmas. I'll play the first piece of the book called Deck the Hall. teacher said when I played this for him, he said, please don't do Silent Night. It's on page 10. I said to him, Bernie, I won't change the melody, I'll just put in nice chords. There's nothing in the Bible, I told him, that says you can't put in nice chords. sequels to this book. This is called Christmas Modern Piano Impressions on that rack back there. Another book on the rack that's more recent is Lee Evans Arranger's Holiday Jazz. Now, my favorite Christmas song is in there. It's the one that Mel Torme, the great singer, wrote, called The Christmas Song, Chestnuts Roasting. Now, I do something very interesting here. I start out with quartal harmony, chords built in intervals of perfect chords. And then I evolve very quickly into triadic or tertian harmony. Back there, the Musical Christmas for Easy Piano solo book, and then Easy Jazz Christmas Duets. Now I have had 5 Christian books with modern harmonizations out there. Four of them are still in print. Beautiful Hymns, and Lee Evans Arranger's Beautiful Hymns and Spirituals, that's this one. They're all on the back rack. Lee Evans Arranger's Contemporary Christian Favorites, is Today's Christian Favorites, and Contemporary Christian Inspirations. These Christian books, wow, they sell like hotcakes. And because I had 5 Christian books out, I thought I ought to create equal time, so I created this Jewish book with modern harmonizations. The Treasury of Jewish Songs, you should have that in your packet too. Let me play the first piece in the book for you. It's the Jewish National Anthem. Three 12-tone waltzes plus student 12-tone composing outlines. Ladies and gentlemen, I have, yes, gentlemen, one gentleman. Ladies and gentlemen, I have served as an adjudicator for many, many years for student compositions. For a group in California years ago called Composers Today, and more recently, or over the last decade at least, for Piano Guild Notes, a magazine put out by the American College of Musicians, National Guild of Piano Teachers. They send their teachers, students, compositions to people like me, professors, authors, composers, and we provide a critique of those compositions and a rating so that you'll know whether to play the piece at a festival if it's worthy. And I'd say that over the years, I've seen hundreds and hundreds of compositions by students, and fewer than 10 sounded as though they were written in the 20th century. They all have Alberti bass or some other 18th century feature, and I don't understand why students living in these times are not writing music that sounds as though they live in these times. In Bach's time, people played the music of Bach. In Beethoven's time, they played the music of Beethoven. In Chopin's time, they played the music of Chopin. And today, what are they playing? Bach, Beethoven, and Chopin. And they're not playing 20th century music. And that's why, since they're not getting 20th century repertoire from the piano teachers, when it comes to writing music, they don't have the 20th century sound in their ears. And so they don't naturally fall into that and write that way. What are some of those devices? Well, there's dissonance, there's odd meters, changing meters, there are all kinds of devices. Now, since there is such a paucity of material out there for the 20th century, I decided to write some intermediate level material that students can play, and they can also learn how to compose in that style. This book consists of 3 waltzes. Well, first of all, if you open the book, there's a CD of me playing the contents of this book here, as you can see. But in the introduction, in 3 pages, I talk about the system of composing that Arnold Schoenberg invented around 1920. It was called the 12-tone system, also known as serialism. What he did was he took the 12 notes of the chromatic scale, mixed them up, let's say, and called that his melody, except the melody in those days was called, in that style was called a tone row. And then he would manipulate it, develop it, by playing it in backwards order, so that was called retrograde. Then he changed the direction of the intervals, called inversion. Then he would take the retrograde and play it in inversion, so it's called retrograde inversion. The idea was to create the sense that there wasn't any one note more important than any other. That's called atonality. Now, if you think of music history, you'll see that evolution of a gradual dissolution of tonality. Music started, the tonality started in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century with the use of the diatonic scales, the major and minor scales, combination of whole steps and half steps. Then came the chromatic scale, the first 8-tonal scale in all of history. And chromaticism weakened tonality. It didn't destroy it because chromaticism and diatonicism coexisted in the music of the Romantic composers of this chromaticism. Then came Debussy, who invented the whole tone scale with equal intervals of whole steps and equal patterns of intervals like the octatonics. And then came Stravinsky, who said, why do we have to be in a particular key? Let's just be in 2 keys. Bitonality, 2 keys at the same time. I don't have 3 hands, but he also wrote polytonality, 3 or more keys at the same time. Bitonality, Petrushka. Polytonality, Le Sacre du Printemps, the Rite of Spring. Then came Schoenberg and said, why do we have to be in any key? So he invented this system in which every note would be equally important. So the system meant that you could not play a note a second time until all the other 11 notes were played. Now you can play the notes one at a time, or you can play them as a cluster, or you can play a mixture of both. And that's what this whole system is about. And if you look at this first piece in the book, which I call half-a-minute waltz, thank you, Frederick Chopin. And then that's on pages 4 and 5. Now, if you look at pages 6 and 7, you see I present the same piece again, but here with an analysis, so the student can tell what it is that I'm doing to compose this piece. Now, if you look at pages 18 and 22, you'll see that I give the student the opportunity to compose 2 pieces in this book, using this 12-tone system to play atonality. So that when the student composes music, the student will then be comfortable with the thought that he or she can be writing in the 20th century style. Let me play this half-a-minute waltz for you on page 4, please. By the way, the first 12 notes are my tone row. Then I play the notes in backwards order, retrograde. Then I play the first 4 notes of the tone row in a cluster. The second 4 notes in a cluster. Next 4 notes in a cluster. And then I have an inversion, which you can see in the analysis. Let me play the piece for you. you don't hear it. They're free beats to the measure.
I cannot dance here.
Yes, we did.
I cannot dance here.
Let me tell you something about the waltz. The waltz originated from an Austrian type of music called Ländler, L-A umlaut, N-D-L-E-R. That music was intended to be danced to. Then came people like Chopin and Schumann and other composers who wrote waltzes that were intended to be listened to without being danced to. Right? All the Chopin waltzes, you don't ever see anybody dancing to them, except maybe in Les Sylphides, the ballet. But waltzes are not, today, waltz has evolved into a piece of music that's intended to be listened to rather than waltzed to. So this is a waltz, but it may not be obvious. But then there are a lot of things that are not obvious.
No, but it doesn't carry on that style.
You mean it's not traditional?
Strong.
Yeah. It's not traditional. Yes, I agree with you, and that's a compliment to me that it's not traditional. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been an absolutely magnificent audience. I've so enjoyed making this presentation.